Hello students, this is an overview of your last paper in this course, EBP 3. This is your qualitative critical appraisal. So you're finding that qualitative study that you found early on in the course and you are going to critique it. Now you've already written a couple papers in this course, so some of this will feel very familiar. So I'm going to focus mostly on where students frankly tend to lose points in this paper or where students tend to struggle. Keep in mind, I want to start off by saying that this is worth more than anything else in the course. This is your last paper, so it really should be the culmination of your hard work and your development as a writer and your understanding of research. So saying that, I always recommend pull up a blank Word doc and then pull up your past papers that we've graded and given you feedback on, and check in and see what were the common things that you tended to lose points on or things that we suggested that you could improve upon, and make a list of those so that as you're writing this last paper, you're reminded, oh yeah, that's right, I need to stop using first person when it's not necessary. And oh yeah, that's right, I need to start using more scholarly language and citing my rationales. So wherever you may have lost points or wherever we gave you feedback on prior papers, we should see all of that really, really improving and really showcasing your skill in this paper. So keep that in mind. All right, so a lot of this looks very familiar. This is, again, 3 pages long, as all of your other papers. We still are telling you to not use quotes in this paper. However, there's one caveat to that. So qualitative studies, when you talk about the results of a qualitative study, the authors come up with themes or domains or categories. And those categories are specific words, so maybe 1 or 2 or 3 words that describe that theme, like stress was a motivator, for instance. Let's say that was a theme. You don't want to paraphrase that because the researchers have come up with this very specific phrase to describe what they discovered, and you paraphrasing that kind of messes it up a little bit. So using a direct quote there is 100% appropriate. However, everything else you write about should be paraphrased and in your own words. So keep that in mind. Direct quotes are okay when you talk about the findings of a qualitative study. But again, it's just the categories or the domains. When you go into explaining what that category means or what that domain means, those are your own words, okay? Again, make sure you're using scholarly sources for this paper. One of the biggest things here, as always, is make sure you cite the author of the chapter in your textbook if you're using your textbook as a reference, not the editors of the textbook. Now we get into our APA. You have your title page and your introduction. No surprises here. Your introduction kind of follows the same format as always. Keep in mind, when you introduce your study, you don't have to include the entire title of the study. That can take up a lot of room. Describe the study that you're going to be talking about and then cite the authors. That is enough to clearly describe the article for this paper. So jumping into information about the evidence. You can read all of these. I can tell you where students typically struggle is, what was the study's design? So if your authors are really, really kind to you and make your life a little easy, they may say, this was a phenomenological study. They just gave you the design. That is the design of the study. However, a lot of times authors will say, this was a qualitative study. And that's not a design. That's a broader methodology. You need to figure out what kind of qualitative study, what was the design within the qualitative methodology. So if you're one of the lucky ones, this will be very simple and you share what the design was because the authors told you outright. If you're one of the unlucky ones where they didn't tell you what the specific design was, you have to figure out what that design was. And this can be tricky. Sometimes authors mix designs together a little bit. They usually will share with you which ones they've mixed together. But how do you figure out what the design was? Well, this is when I pull you back to one of the resources we talked about earlier in the course when we were introducing qualitative research. And we have this lovely little table here that helps you figure out, okay, if it's phenomenology, these are kind of the types of questions they're asking. These are the types of sampling and data collection and data analysis they would use. And if I see them citing these people, there's a good chance it's phenomenology. I would really focus on research questions, however, because that's when that type of methodology is best suited. But this should help you kind of figure out, okay, well, they did say something about a hermeneutic circle, and they kept saying for their research questions that this was about a meaning of something and the lived experience of something. And they did cite Husserl. So this must be phenomenology. So in your paper, you're not only going to say this was a phenomenological study, but you need to tell us, why that was a phenomenological study if the authors didn't tell you. Now, next you'll talk about the strengths of that design, not the strengths of the study that you're reading, but why are phenomenological studies great? Why are grounded theory studies strong? Why are qualitative descriptive studies strong? So you're going to talk about the general strengths of that general design. Tell us about the sample that was used, how they recruited that sample, the type of sampling methodology is used. So make sure you refer to your textbook about which type of methodology was used. That's right in your text. The roles of the researcher can be kind of tricky, but really this is where you're telling us about how the researcher and really the author or authors interacted with the participants and what they did in the study. Sometimes this is really clear and they'll tell you, the primary researcher did the data collection and data analysis, but they had a research assistant doing recruitment, for instance. So you're telling us about what the researcher did, but also if they share relationship that the researcher had with the participants. Maybe the researcher was the owner of the clinic, for instance. So what were their roles and what was their relationship with the study? And then data collection, obviously, you're going to be talking about, as well as data collection in terms of the rationale between the data collection method, and make sure you're citing all of these rationales, okay? So that is your information about the evidence. The results, this is, even though there's fewer bullet points here, this is really the purpose of your whole paper, is to tell us, okay, what did they discover and was it trustworthy? So in the results, you're really telling us what were the main findings? What did they discover by doing this study? And you're going to discuss the main findings in the body of your paper that are relevant to your PICO question. And then in your table, you're going to do an exhaustive list of all of the findings. So this would probably look like the theme or the category in quotes, and then giving us maybe a one-sentence description of what that theme actually means. Again, you also want to make sure that once you've looked at these findings, does this support your PICO? Does this help inform your PICO? Or does this not help you inform your PICO? Or does this not support your PICO? With qualitative research, this is a little trickier because you are only required to have 2 elements of your PICO question in this qualitative study. So for example, if it only really talked about my population and the outcome, but not the intervention, well, maybe that gave me helpful information about this phenomenon that goes on in my population. So that helped me inform my PICO. Or maybe the outcomes are really not that helpful to me if I wanted to actually do this intervention to help this population. So tell us about how it supports or does not support your PICO question, how it informs your PICO question, and always, always, always give us some rationale for why you believe that's true. Then you're going to talk about the data analysis process, give us a summary in the body of your paper, and then you can go into more detail in your table. So all these things will show up in your table. The idea is in the body of your paper, because you only have 3 pages, you're going to be talking about what relates to your PICO, and you're going to be summarizing, and you're going to be giving us the key points. And then in your table, you're going to be more exhaustive. You're going to include a lot more detail. So the next section, probably the toughest one, is trustworthiness of the evidence. So in your paper, you're going to pick 2 of the elements of trustworthiness. Remember, you have credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So in your paper, you're going to pick 2 of those that you think you can best talk about from the article. They address credibility and dependability, for instance. So I'm going to talk about those 2 elements of trustworthiness in the body of my paper, how the authors enhanced those things, maybe a couple of ways that they were threatened, for example. But let's say my authors didn't talk about trustworthiness, period. I still have to pick 2 of these elements. And by reading the study, I have to say how it was enhanced or threatened, depending on what I read, right? So if there's still not enough to work with, I would say, well, they didn't really give me much to work with and they didn't address it. So I need to identify, and here's where this shows up in your guidelines. If nothing was done to enhance a specific element, describe a specific way they could have enhanced it. So best case scenario, your authors discussed it and you discuss those 2 elements in the body of your paper. If they didn't really discuss it, you still need to dig a little bit and figure out how the authors discuss those 2 elements of trustworthiness. And if there's nothing to work with there, the best you can do is say, well, I'm going to pick credibility and dependability, and this is how they could have enhanced these 2 elements. So regardless, you will be discussing trustworthiness. It just depends on how much they gave you to work with. Now that's for the body of your paper, and make sure you always give rationale for why you believe it was enhanced or threatened. And then in the table, you're going to discuss all elements of trustworthiness. So again, doesn't have to be full sentences, but you're going to address credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability in your table. And then the same rules apply, where if they gave you something to work with, then you're going to include all of that. You're also going to look and figure out what you can infer from the information they gave you that maybe they didn't talk about, but you figured it out on your own. And then if there really isn't much to work with there, then you're going to tell us how they could have enhanced each of those 4 elements. So bottom line, you're going to discuss eventually all 4 elements of trustworthiness, but you're going to focus on 2 in the body of your paper, and you're going to summarize all 4 in the table. And then last, we have strengths and limitations. So what were the major strengths of the study? Remember, this is an important topic. That's not a strength. Or these findings are really cool. That's not a strength. The strengths are the specific ways that they conducted their study that made it a high quality study. Okay, so find 2 strengths of the study to discuss in your paper. And then you want to tell us why those are actual strengths. You can't just say, well, because they had 35 people in the study. Why? Why is that a strength and why is that not a weakness? So make sure you're clear on sharing why these things are strengths. And then obviously in your table, you're going to list all the possible strengths that there were in this study. And then same thing with limitations. Pick 2 to talk about in your paper and tell us why those are limitations, and then give us a nice list of all the possible limitations in the table. So again, you've got your references. The table is going to show up after your references. Again, anything that you put in your table doesn't need to be cited because your author is already at the top. But if you have a direct quote, you need to put the page number next to that direct quote. And always, always, always remember, submit your paper in PDF format so that the formatting doesn't get messed up in Canvas. Submit your article in PDF format as well so we can refer back to that. And there you go. So I hope this is helpful. As usual, always, always make sure you're looking through your rubric and making sure that I can find out exactly where I discussed this in my paper and exactly where I discussed this in my paper. And you can see how these points are reflected. So I hope this is helpful, and feel free to post questions to the discussion board as well.